All right, so thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a long time coming to do this presentation. I see this night more as a book presentation rather than a release, because the book itself is a very large volume, as some of you might have already noticed, and I really wanted to present to some of you what I've been up to in the last 5 years. So pace yourselves. If you this is going to be a bit of an intense hour, so you can drink coffee to keep up, or you can drink alcohol to give up. All right, so here we go. Let's see if this is working. Here we go. So Cultura Rasa, the emergence and replicative nature of socio-cultural societies. The title, Rasa, the word itself, means a lot of times when people think about tabula rasa, which is the more common term that everyone knows, it usually means blank slate. What blank slate represents is when people are born, a lot of times people say that we're born as a blank slate, and everything that we learn as a result is built off of what we learn from scratch. Now, what's not known is that rasa itself, the word, doesn't mean blank. It actually means the essence of, which means that there's certain building blocks that we are built off out of, and then from those building blocks our development is built on top of. And that's what I essentially started exploring and wanted to really dig deep in. My initial attempt with this project was I had a few questions that were not clear, but in order to really fully understand the background of the answers that I wanted to answer, the questions that I wanted to answer, I started exploring. The more I explored, the more I went down the rabbit hole of this project, and as a result, 5 years later, I had this huge manuscript that I decided just to kind of put together, release, and now here we are. What else? What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing some excerpts from the book itself. Some of the pages might have a lot of information. I'm going to try to focus you all into very specific parts of the slides. So try to ignore the fine prints, because it might be a lot. With questions, as Johnson said, save them for later. If anything's unclear in the moment, you can interrupt just to make sure that we're on the same page. Otherwise, I'll just keep going just to make sure I can get through the whole thing. And I hope you did your, biology, chemistry, psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, all of that 101, and prepared for this, because there might be some lingo that I might throw out that might be new. I had to review a lot of this as I went along. Okay, so you might have seen the image that I threw on in front of you. If you have one of these copies, feel free to grab one, and you can just read in between to see what I'm talking about. It'll probably be helpful. That's why I decided to print those. You're welcome to take it home if you want afterwards, but essentially have that handy just if you want to see what's going on. All right, so first of all, I want to point out that there's, in the process of learning about all these things, I want to point out that I want to make a clear distinction when we talk about three domains. There's the domain of matter, there's the domain of, so right there's matter, there's life, and there's culture. And I want to approach each one of these very separately. If we're talking about matter, we're talking about matter. We're not mixing in the other two domains, and vice versa. Within each one of these worlds, there'll be certain forces that'll be acting within them. Okay, and each one of these worlds will have certain entities in them that will be merging other entities out of them, as I will explore soon. But the main premise I want you to know is that the world of matter particularly deals with force fields. What I mean by that is that any entity that emerges within the world of matter will create a force field around it. That's a technical term that I came across. Basically, if you have an atom itself will have electrons around it, and it will create a specific force around it, which will now act upon the world around it. Similarly, the world of life, it will, any entity within the worlds of life that comes out, whether it's a small unicellular organism or a large multicellular organism, will create its own type of a force, which I will call need, which is essential living needs that every living form is born with. So that will be their force. And then finally, the world of cultures will every entity within the world of cultures that comes out will be guided by the forces, if you will, of rules and laws. So basically, whether it's a small tribal group or if it's a large nation state, they will all be operating and be driven as a whole by rules and laws. The next thing I'll point out is that force fields, which are in the world of matter, emerge needs. So I will start off with, this is the Big Bang, as you can see, and I'll go through all this. And different things will emerge out of each one of these entities. And eventually, life will emerge. And that's where one of my focuses is. And this bubble right here is really that bubble right there. If it was up to me, it would have been just one long stream of things emerging, okay? So this will go back to the beginning and it will start all over. So world of force fields will emerge needs. But what's even more important is that those needs will eventually emerge cultural forms. So needs will emerge rules and laws, ultimately. So bear that in mind when we're going through this whole thing. I'll throw this one in as well, God. Trying to define, trying to talk about our universe and about everything around us can be approached in a very, what's the word? We can get very clinical about it, but I really wanted to see, since it's a book about cultures and how cultural forms function, the concept of spirituality and deities and all that. You can't avoid that conversation, and a lot of people have their own take on what God means to them, what any kind of a spiritual entity means to them. As far as I'm concerned, I cheekily sometimes call these three domains as the Holy Trinity. I call matter the Father, and then the Father, you have the Son, which will be life, because life comes out of matter. And for me, cultures would be the third Holy Trinity, which is the Holy Spirit, which is great because culture in itself is like always thought of being something that lives within us and we can't really see, even though the neurons are fully embedded in us. But I'll get to that. All right, here we go. Pace yourselves. I'm just going to go for it here. So my main intention is to see what the building blocks of cultural forms really are. And just like we can start off with elementary particles on this side to describe how life evolved, I realized that since cultures really exist in animals, but I'll talk about that in detail soon, I wanted to see what are the building blocks of life that would have emerged cultures ultimately. And I realized I started off from cell components, which is this. I call them networks of families of biomolecules, but they're really just parts of cells, which when combined together emerge cells. Just like elementary particles combine to do composite particles. And notice how I'm telling the two stories together. That's just because I found it easier to talk about these concepts if I've noticed that there's certain similarities in the way the different emergent systems emerge different other systems, and especially when it comes to replication, I was curious to see what would be the analogous thing in the cultural replicative systems that you can translate and compare to of the way how life is replicated itself. And I was actually amazed to see how many similarities there are. Now, whether we want to compare it or not is beside the point. But mainly, I realized that there are similarities. In any case, the story remains, as far as cultural replication is concerned, which I'll explore in this line. The lower line is the main one I'm going to be building from. I try to really stick to as much of research that I've found that deals with these kind of subjects. So in this picture, we have cell components that will, in combination together, emerge cells. But now notice that viruses are in there. And there's this good old question of whether viruses are alive or not. And I've realized that the question is formulated really wrongly. The reason why it's because it's not whether viruses are alive or not, but more whether viruses are involved in living systems or not. And the answer from that angle is, yeah, they're fully involved in living systems. It'll be sort of like as if we asked whether moving my hand is cultural. Well, depends. It can be definitely involved in a culture. And if it does, then we can call it living. Same with the viruses. And some of the viruses can be benign or not. In any case, they're involved in the process and they're fully part of cellular systems. And then cellular systems is, as we all would know, there's, unicellular organisms, and they build up all the way to multicellular organisms. And notice that each one of these subgroups as well represent the babushkas that you see at the front cover. Basically, if you imagine a big collection of, I'll start from the very beginning. If you imagine all sorts of elementary particles that did not combine into composite particles, they will be the upper babushka, but the moment they get combined into composite particles, they're just in a different emergent system. And that's how I'm looking at it. And they're all packaged in a way where you can almost narrow them down into, this is kind of like a nice trick to know how to package classification of these different entities so that we would understand them better. So similarly, elementary particles will combine to create composite particles, and cell components will combine to create cells. And if cell components never did that, they would just float around and not be living, really. They would just do their own thing. But at the moment they're in here, they're cells. So here's where I choose a very specific path, because again, to remind, I'm interested in what entity is responsible for creating a cultural form. And if you look at this small bubble on your sheets, you'll see that it says neurons and framework cells, okay? Now, as far as I'm concerned, we can talk about cultural systems being formed primarily out of networks of neurons and framework cells. And what I mean by framework cells in this case is that everything that is not neurons in our bodies. Essentially, our entire bodies are composed of neurons. They're everywhere. Like, if you look it up, neurons are pretty much everywhere. Oh no! And framework cells, even though there are specific framework cells that work directly with neurons, your bones are just as much as framework cells because they're right there to help the neurons be able to move our bodies around, which helps with survival and eventually also helps with creating cultures, as if you will. I'll get to another point. Notice that I've left out the trees and the mushrooms and all the other different types of living creatures outside of this picture, because there's claims also that these entities here can also be cultural and have intelligence. But I'm leaving that aside for now because I'm specifically focusing on in animal cultures right now. In a sense, I'm saying that cultures are specifically driven by neural networks. And as you see here, I called each one of these I called elemental knowledges. Now I want to explore this concept a bit more. A memory region, okay, so, and you'll notice that I'm running the two stories side by side. I did this just because I found it very interesting to see how an atom has its nucleus inside, and then it has its electrons spinning around that creates a specific orbital that'll then have the force field, as I mentioned earlier, that'll exert its force and influence the world around itself. A memory region is a region, say, in an animal body that constantly fires and does a specific function, okay? Now, notice that neurons and all the framework cells are put. They're embedded and they're embodied in our bodies, and they don't move around at all. Basically, once certain neurons start doing their function, they're always there doing their function. But what's more interesting is that they would not be able to do their function unless they would be able to create a charge in order to it's called an action potential, in order to enable, for example, me to move my hand. So every time I move my hand, a bunch of so-called neurotransmitters are being passed back and forth and building this energy force or field in order for me to move my hand, right? And they're going back and forth. Just like an electron is spinning around the nucleus and constantly establishing the presence of that atom, similarly, these neurotransmitters that are in between all of the neurons and in between all the what are they called? Framework cells, they're constantly being fired up. And them being fired up regularly is what maintains them. It's called long-term potentiation. There's a lot of very, very technical terms. But the bottom line is it's sort of like repetition makes better. Practice makes perfect. Meaning the more you do something, the more it's practiced. Now, let me just see. And so notice that what I just described is technically not too different from, say, a tree. Because a tree has its own chemical messengers that are being passed around. It's just that in this case, it's neurons dealing with their own chemical messengers. And another difference between the two is that I specifically focus on bilateral animals because they were born with brains. And once you have a brain, you can actually store information, whereas most of the living forms that don't have brain type of structures will end up with information just flowing back and forth. So that's why the concept of mycelia or trees or anything being intelligent is a harder pitch. Or at least it's harder to compare the two entities to be similar because trees just simply don't have brains. And it's really within the brains that all the work gets done, and that's where I'll get to. If that makes sense? Now I want to define the term knowledge. As I defined the memory region, knowledge is any consistent recurrence of a specific memory region or memory regions. Okay, so I just want to put that down because that's how I will be thinking about it. And I'm taking a big step from the more generally understood term knowledge, which is the scientific knowledge, scientific definition of knowledge, which means an empirically tested and proven piece of information that happens to be true. Okay, and I like to call that one, this definition right here is versus what I like to call the objectively measured factually true knowledge, or MFT, like all my freaking truth. That's my shortcut for it. But what I mean by that is that it has to be objective. In order for something to be empirically proven, you have to be objectively able to measure it. Then you have to, first it has to be objective. Then you have to find a way to measure it. So you have to have something to compare it to. So if there's something that's objective, but you don't have, the Greenwich, what is it? What's a meter? How do we know how long a meter is? Like there's a specific, a stick somewhere in Greenwich or somewhere that has a specific length. And based on that, we can measure everything else. It's no different with temperature, boiling point, that's our 0, or 100, or the freezing is 0. So everything in that domain has to be measured compared to something else. And even then, we're not done, because we still have to show that whatever we're objectively measuring is true in the first place. So first, it has to be factual. And factual means that you have to have a bunch of statistical information, statistical data that you have to first collect. And out of that, to choose a fact by definition would mean that you have data that shows that something recurs enough for you to call it a fact in the first place. And then a fact will be true if you show that it's true, if it checks out every time. So this definition of a knowledge, in the way I define it in this whole project, is really a subgroup of what I call knowledge. And I'll explain why as I go along. Alternatively, if you don't like the word knowledge being mixed up with the empirical one, you can think of it as a learning. So anything that we learn, like you learning to move your hand, can be, and a technical term for that is a Hebbian learning, and then you can look that up if you want. Another way you can think of it is a memory. So anything we can memorize can be a knowledge. And there's a couple of other technical terms are schema and a frame. You can look that up as well. Schemas and frames are very specific terminologies that directly deal with our how our nervous systems work and how they form the clouds, if you will, of knowledge or memory or learning. Okay. All right, so here we go. So these are the elements of matter. So this is, I've just kind of decided to show how each one of the elements that we defined have a very specific nucleus, and around them there's a bunch of electrons spinning. So everybody knows this, everyone studies this. And what I had a problem with, the reason why I got down this rabbit hole of writing about this whole thing, is because I was never really satisfied with the fact that the worlds of matter, everything was very, very strictly classified. Even the world of life was so classified, everyone knew exactly what a gene is, what an electron is. But as soon as we got into the world of cultural forms, there's just so much disagreement that I decided to take a huge step back and kind of try to do definitions of my own in order to build the picture from bottom up. So as a result, I created the equivalent plot or a picture of what I call the elements of knowledge, or elements of memory, or all the elemental knowledges, if you will. So if you look at a specific human body, every area of our body is serving some kind of a function. And if you narrow it down enough, you can actually find that a specific area in our body will be in charge of very specific processes that you can really isolate and really call it, well, this is this unit. And you can always pare it down further and further. On the left-hand side here, I have experiences. This is not in the handouts. I didn't print everything out. But don't try to read again. This is one of the perfect examples where you don't want to look at all the details. But essentially, we have this left side here is everything that is coming in. So all the neurons in our bodies that are in charge of collecting information inwardly are on the left side. Everything that is in charge of doing things outwardly, pretty much all the motion that we do, and the names are afferent and efferent, that's another technical term for it, is going to be on this side. Now what I've also done is that I've also separated these two into two important domains, and that is that an experience can be an objective experience, but it also can be a subjective feeling experience right here. And feelings are actually essentially the information that your body is collecting about your own viscera, about your own body. Okay, so that's what I termed feelings, and I think it was Antonio Damasio, when I was looking him up, that created a very good distinction between emotions and feelings, because he said that when you emote something, an emotion is an output. It's actually your body creating an effect outwardly, but what a feeling is that how you feel about that specific emotion displaying itself. And so I decided to look up, and I did a lot of research and asked a lot of questions about which part of the body would be in charge of creating feelings. And as good as I could find, and as much as I could narrow it down, it's really the insular cortex, for example, that is in charge of collecting the information and creating our subjective feelings. So it's my little finger is not in charge of feeling. It's in the limbic system, in the insular system. Limbic is in emotions. But just so you know, so in there somewhere is where the subjectivity essentially emerges with a combination of everything else that's going on. But this was probably the most difficult part for me, the feeling part, especially because I would say that the subjective world is the one that is the biggest problem when we want to talk objectively, because it's subjective. It's actually completely outside of this domain up here, okay? Furthermore, another distinction that I wanted to create is the distinction between making movements of just moving my hand, which is just basically a somatic movement versus actually doing creating words. So I isolated specific parts of the brain that are specifically in charge of me being able to say, okay, that's a table over there, right? Now, there's an entity that I can experience. I can point my finger toward it, which is a motor function. But the act of me drawing your attention to that entity right there, or my own attention to that entity, and being able to say a word like table is what it takes there is actually a specific brain part, brain area that specifically deals with that. When it comes to output, to motor, that's Broca's area. Some of you might know. Broca's area is particularly in charge of me being able to say the word table and associate that with that thing right there. And when you hear me say that, the Wernicke's area on the other side is your input, being able to associate as an input me saying table and you seeing that table and having that input. So I've tried as much as I can to isolate as many of these regions and just call them, these memory regions are going to be isolated in such a way where now I'm going to treat them as elements that are now combining in different ways and creating different kinds of, effects. And one final thing that I want to throw out is that right here I have auditory system. Like, for example, if you want to contest of like, well, what is the note A, 440 hertz? So like, and this is where it gets interesting, because just like an orbital of an atom kind of like fades out into the thin air. Similarly, the area of neurons that is in charge of detecting the frequency of 440 hertz will also have its dissipating neurons that will be in charge of other frequencies that are right next to it. But the body is honing in on that specific frequency, right? Now, as I'll explore as I go along, cultural systems take some of those frequencies on. Like, for example, there's a lot of people who contest 440 hertz, and they say that that's the wrong frequency. 432 is the actual cosmological frequency. So you have a lot of musicians who are like creating music in 432 and just messing everyone up in the process. And that's where the competition between which of these emergences, if you will, get culturally adopted and become standardized and become norms. That's where my interest lies with this whole project. Another distinction that I want to point out is that each one of these areas I've divided also into ethos, pathos, and logos. Okay? Oh no, she's fine. She can just, yeah. So the reason why I wanted to create this distinction is because modes of persuasion, which was defined way back in thousands of years ago, is the way of how we convince each other whether something should be standardized or not. Okay, and ethos. And so yet again, just like you go up and look up what's the Holy Trinity, which I did, I suggest you go and look up what does it mean, what is the Holy Trinity, and you realize that there's millions of different interpretations of it. Similarly, I realized that ethos, pathos, and logos sort of had very loose definitions. So I decided, well, I'll hone in on it, see how much I can get with it, with my own research on this one. And I've decided, I really wanted to, when I talk about ethos, I want to talk about sensory motor domain exclusively. So basically, if I move my right hand and you see me move my right hand, that's my motor, your sensory, that's all there is. So movements and objective experiences are going to be in the domain of ethos. So every time I talk about ethos, that's what I mean. It's just whatever we see, whatever our senses are essentially in charge of, and our movements conversely, because they're the ones that are talking between each other. And then pathos will be particularly involved in whatever our visceral areas are doing and how we're emoting emotions, because the emotional domain is very separate from just moving your hand. Emotion is conveying a different kind of information. So that's why it's important to separate it in a separate domain. And all of our bodies are very, very attuned to emoting, and then the animals around us picking up on that emotion one way or the other. Like you can imitate the emotion, or if you're around a cat and you start screaming, the cat's just going to get out of there. If you're calm, the cat will be calm. So there's a lot of interplay on an emotional and feeling level between the two. And then finally, I have the logos. And as much as logos for me will be specifically dealing with semantic domain. So basically the ability to assign, which is what I said about the table earlier, the ability to assign a specific symbol or attribute a specific word, whatever it may be, onto another entity. So you're kind of using some of the ethos, which is like being the ability to just utter a word or move a hand, but these specific regions are in charge of connecting those two and creating, which is where language emerges out of this, okay? So and that's why logos in itself, in the Greek word means, in Greek the word means word, or reason, which I found really interesting, because when you're able to create language out of words, that's where meaning really comes out of. This is another big thing that I realized through looking through this lens, is that the reason why you have is really your explanation of why you're doing something. It's all within the language. So that all sort of relates in some way or another. And then finally, there's the social intelligent builders, which I actually totally realized I forgot to point out. These areas here are just areas in our brain. They're in charge of using all of this here to just do sociality, for us to be able to do what we're doing right now. Okay? Because I'm using all of this right now. But these, and then these are like the players that are just kind of making sure that we can be social, so that we're not just drifting off. Okay, so far so good? Can I just keep going? I just have a glass of water because I think my mouth's getting dry. It's my perfect opportunity to talk a lot. Yeah. All right, so next. Types of elemental knowledges. Particularly so this is where I found, this is personally to me a very entertaining process to do, because I wanted to isolate what are the memory regions that are in charge of creating cultures in particular. So in the world of life, schnops are the carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur are like the 6 elements that are the main elements. It's like 90-something% of all the atoms that are in our bodies are those 6 atoms. The rest is just minerals and trace elements that you have to take, right? And so similarly, I'm like, well, obviously, I call it MEOF. So movements, emotions, objective experiences, and feelings, which is the ones I just worded. Those are, it's almost, you can't miss it, because it's so, they're so present in our lives that we don't really think of it as something that's always there, but they're the main ingredients. And besides them, it's really the processes of being able to do imitation, empathy, and syntax that create the sociality and emerge culture out of it. So I started focusing specifically on those, even though the ones that are outside of it, like for example, the ability to breathe. Like me able to breathe is really not very much involved in culture. Like we're all breathing right now, but it's not like, well, if you stop breathing, you won't be in part of the culture either, but it's not like it's actively involved in it. I really geeked out. Like I'm talking about this very, very, what is it, face value? Is that the word? No, I don't think it is. Matter of fact, thanks, Owen. So this is the world of Lakoff. If anyone's familiar with work of George Lakoff, he really talks about how specific areas of our brains will actually combine to create larger entities. So just like elements combine into molecules, similarly, memory regions will create larger networks of other memory regions that will all fire up at the same time. And I call that a composite knowledge. I didn't have a better word for it. I wanted to, this is probably the only term, outside of calling everything a knowledge, this is probably the only term that I had to kind of invent, because I didn't really have a good term that would describe, there was, like Lakoff used the word primary metaphors, or complex metaphors. But the problem with those is they were very specific in his definition, but there was nothing that really described just a bunch of memory regions firing at the same time and with the same spike train, as they call it. But what's the most interesting thing about the creation of these new emergent entities, and you see every time you combine a bunch of things, a new entity emerges. In the world of matter, you have to first have a chemical reaction to create the molecule. But once the molecule is actually created, then physical reaction, all it does is just engage that molecule. So you can have a protein floating in your body, and it'll only get triggered, or it'll become active or serve a function if it gets physically engaged. Okay? So that's not a chemical reaction, and that's a very important distinction between the two. Similarly, when it comes to knowledges, what we're learning in our bodies to do, there's the process of learning to do a specific thing, but once you've learned something, then you can at any point cognitively engage that learning. Okay? So for example, if you know that you can't cross the street on a red light, right now that knowledge of crossing the street is completely on a standby. It's not engaged. I did learn it. So it's on a standby, and we have all of our knowledge that we've ever learned is like that. It's on standby when you need it. So the moment you come to the street light, you don't have to learn that you have to wait for the green light to go. It just gets engaged, and then you play it out. So that's what the distinction I create is a cognitive learning, most of which happens when we're Lila May's age over there, right? Like, she's learning all the things step by step, and by the time you're an adult, most of the things are learned, and you just have to engage them to be able to survive in the world, right? So that's something that I wanted to point out. Okay, so in the world of all this learning and engaging, my focus now, because it's all in the aim of wanting to get to where cultures emerge. I had to focus on interactive learnings, which for me, in the grand analogy that I decided to do, would be the equivalent of what an organic reaction would be. Because anything that's not an organic reaction is not going to render any life. Similarly, anything that's not an interactive learning is not going to be cultural. It says if you decide to go for a walk in the endowment lands tomorrow just to have your own walk by yourself, that's not cultural at all, because it doesn't involve other people. You might learn something there and then come back and bring it into culture, but in and of itself is not cultural. There needs to be an interaction happening. Now, every animal is social. Every animal, because we have to mate. So even in the turtle that's born and just swims off into the ocean by itself, will actually sooner or later have to become social, because it will have to mate. So all animals start off that as a kind of like the first building block of sociality. But then, as evolution continued, various different things got added to the mix. So for example, co-parenting came up, so where the animals just got born with an instinct where they would just stick around together to raise the little young. And then there'll be cohabiting. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that all the animals are only genetically related. There'll be just a bunch of other animals that can be helpers as well, and in the process. Then you can have grandparenting that can come in. And what's interesting about grandparenting, that solidifies for that culture, for that social group to really stay really, really solid throughout the generations as well. So it's not only that social groups solidified between the two animals that will die in the next 100 years, but the social group maintains itself in a very strict unity, if you will, throughout the generations as well. And then eventually, throughout that whole process, So I want to point out something very important in this process. Now, in this whole thing, in these whole interactions here, what happens is there's a lot of new learnings that happen that are only related to to that social group. Okay? It's something that you were not born with, and the way that works is just in the world of matter that is becoming life. So any interactions or chemical reactions that are happening that will eventually become a living form, the way it has been described is they're officially called driver reactions, if you look it up, which means there's going to be one molecule or atom that will interact with a bunch of things, and eventually the same thing will get created, and it'll just keep going in circles like that. Now, it's unregulated. It's just happening randomly. That's the good old primordial soup, if you look into this. And similarly, animals, as they interact, will, through their through their observational or learning, they will be going through a certain amount of learnings amongst each other, where sooner or later, whatever this individual learned from this person will be able to learn, oh, I moved my right hand, the other person moves the homologous part, because the brain just evolved to be able to recognize that specific movement and replicate it. And then, so this person will, through a series of cognitive processes, learn to do exactly what this person did. And then it'll do that to other people, and that cultural, well, it's not cultural yet, just like this is not necessarily life yet. It's just a random interaction of atoms and molecules that are creating these feedback loops that are happening over and over again. Similar in sociality, that would start happening, okay? Now, here's probably the meat of the whole thing. One very, very interesting, here's a batch that I'm about to present to you, a batch of cognitive processes that humans do that surpass most animals, okay? So we have two people here, okay? I'll start from this bottom part here, okay? So the main thing that our brains evolved to do is to be able to mimic. Now in that, so the ability to mimic somebody's movements, if I move my right hand, you actually have, this is where the mirror neurons come into play. Because notice that when people talk about mirror neurons, the mirror neurons got a lot of, like, flack or slack? Flack? Quack? Anyways, mirror neurons are really put down when they were found out, because they're like, well, the mirror neuron is not doing anything, like, you can't do everything. That's, I think, was one of the criticism of it. I'm like, well, they're not doing everything, but they are directly involved in that mimicking process, which means they're directly involved with me moving my right hand and you being able to see my right hand and be able to translate in your mind that it's the right hand, because notice you're just getting input as far as you're concerned. Like, I'm moving my hand, but you're not moving anything yet. What you're doing is you're seeing me move my hand, and your brain is, with the help of mirror neurons, translating that into, oh, I see, that person's actually moving their right hand, and then it's connecting that part of the brain that has you seeing moving my hand into you actually moving your right hand, okay? So that's that part of mimicking, okay? Then the second process, and so mimicking, empathy, and listening, as far as I'm concerned, are three very, very strong imitative behaviors that humans have evolved. Mimicking is an obvious one because we just imitate. That's usually what imitation is called, mimicking. But for me, I kind of use imitation as like an umbrella term for all of these. So empathy for me would be the process of not imitating my right hand, but me getting all flustered, and then your body recognizing that, and your body just automatically getting flustered. And then furthermore, and this is only certain animals emerge this ability, which is to actually have language and be able to have me tell a story or say a word or a sentence, and for your brains to actually be able to take like all the words that I've said tonight, pretty much, other than the expressions that I randomly invented, you have learned before, right? So there's nothing new for you in this one. All you're doing is that you're using my words to use the same words that you have in your brains to put together a picture that is imitated picture of the one that I have, and then we're doing that through language. And so as far as I'm concerned, I maintain that the act of listening is actually an act of imitating. A direct act of imitating, but it's much higher level. It's not me just moving my right hand. It's me able to transmit a really complex story into your minds. Okay? Now, what gets even more interesting with humans, because theory of mind is one of the things that really had really confused me a lot, because I find that the expression theory of mind is just so clunky and so ridiculous that it should be renamed. I renamed it into, I believe, attribution or projection. So theory of mind is like when I say, you know what I know, or I know what you know. Like those abilities, as far as I'm concerned, is the ability of me able to move my hand and then be able to project onto one of you and say, well, you can move your hand as well. So it's almost like the opposite process of what imitation or mimicking does. So that's why we are all able to be like, well, when I'm upset, then, well, I say, well, you're upset. But that's a classic psychological term of saying, well, that's just a projection. That's where it comes from, because human brains can project. And for me, I think that's directly tied to the concept of theory of mind. And of course, projecting stories is another one where I have a story in my mind of what things should be, and you should think the same way I do. Right? So that's how we project our minds, and that's where manipulation comes in from. And manipulation, I don't mean that it has to be something that is negative. Manipulation is really just the ability to have a story in your head in order to be able to project onto the community around you, which the amazing thing about this is that if there's an idea that we all imitate off of each other and also project onto each other, that feedback loop really solidifies that knowledge, whatever it may be, that learning. So this is where cultural systems can become extremely solidified, because there's that feedback loop, and that's why in humans, cultures are so prevalent. But it gets even more complicated, because humans we're able to create the entity in our own heads. We can say, well, you know, everyone who is Canadian or everyone who's in this room has to think a certain way, and then we can use the exact same processes to think of something, project it onto the entity, and then use that to project onto someone else. So it's not like me, I'm coming to you and saying, well, you have to do what I do. You have to do what it's written in that book over there, which makes it even more complicated. I didn't get too much into details, but we're as good as doing that with just hypothetical entities in total. That's where I think religiosity and spirituality and being able to use totally like hypothetical concepts in order to make our points onto and project them onto other people. So anyways, this is a whole section in the book that I've read about. I'm trying to run through as many as I can, but this is essentially the one of the big pieces of the puzzle that I found in the process. Cool? Can I keep going? Is it too much yet? No? Okay, cool. All right, so next. How are we doing with time? Oh yeah, I think I'm so far. All right, so if you look at the actual bubbles inside of the molecules, you'll see that, and this is where life itself, for example, emerges. There's specific molecules that are called functional groups that they arise naturally. Okay, the process between this and this is where life emerges, and that is that we have functional groups that just arise in nature. But in the process of the interactions and processes that I just described, they will start to create epigenetic, well, first of all, DNA and proteins, which are the polymers, and the epigenetic tags that govern them as well. This is the interesting process that happens. So I thought, well, what is it in societies that does the same process? And I realized that the main processes that are, and I had to name them. You have to give names to something in order to make sense out of it. And I called them in these two bubbles down here, cultural norms and cultural bids. So cultural norm is everything that you learned that is the norm of the society. Like everyone has to sit in a chair and listen right now, right? That's the norm right now. If, you know, Johnson started shouting right now, that everyone would be like, what are you doing, right? Yeah, that would be normal. Yeah, exactly. But a cultural bid is, cultural norm is input, cultural bid is output. That's how I think of it. And they have the same interplay that DNA and proteins have, because DNA create proteins, but not really, because proteins use DNA to create proteins. And I go into super detail about this in the writing, because it's funny how every protein that you know is directly associated with a DNA. It's not like it's the DNA that make the proteins. They've been making each other since life started. Similarly, the behaviors that we exert on each other have been creating our cultural norms since cultures emerged. It's the same thing, okay? And then for me, what I found is that the epigenetic tags that actually govern, and the epigenetics are not only in multicellular organisms. This is whoever learned about epigenetics. Epigenetics are there in every organism. Even the smallest bacterium has to have some methyl group that will express the gene at some point depending on the circumstances. And what I realized is that the things that really keep the cohesion of a social group, even though that there is norms, are judgments. Judgments, how we judge each other at all times, is what maintains the social group. Okay, so I've grouped those like that. And to give, let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, so just to give an example, you don't have to look at these. So these are like the different nucleotides create DNA, amino acids create proteins, and conditioned experiences and conditioned motions are really just conditionings. Like when you hear the standard conditioning, psychological definition of what a conditioning is, it really is about you having the innate objective experience. Like, for example, there's a loud sound, and you were genetically born to respond to that sound in a specific way. However, this third element is whatever was around will then get added to that picture. And that whatever, if someone has, if someone shouts really loudly and has a red hat, you'll be afraid of a person with a red hat from there on. And notice how that learning is different, because it's not, that would be a cultural learning rather than a genetic learning. And that's where the variety in cultural expressions comes in, okay? But, and these are examples of brain MRI scans where hearing a word triggers very specific areas of the brain, seeing a word triggers a very specific, and these areas of the brain get triggered every time. Now there might be some variance, but overall it's pretty much the same. Cool? And then finally, just like what I showed you earlier in the process of having these specific driver reactions, once you have those driver reactions in the context of a living system inside of it, then the official term, even though it's still a driver reaction, the official term in the science lingo is signal transduction. So signal transduction would be any cascade of biochemical processes, because if it's in a living system, it's biochemical. If it's outside of it, it's a chemical. But they're all chemical reactions. It's just a technical term that describes it. So once in a living system, we would call that a signal transduction, and that signal transduction is protected by the system itself. Similarly, in a cultural system, I call them a strategy. This is precisely why I always struggled with having conversations and being able to have a very defined term of what exactly you mean. Well, did you learn this on your own while you were walking Pacific Spirit Park, or did you learn it because somebody came down and explained to you how to do it? And if it's the latter, I would call that a strategy. I just decided to choose that word. And those strategies are all social observational learnings that within a cultural system are like rigorously maintained. Okay? Now, out of this, we have a whole bunch of different things that emerge and arise, okay? Different bodies of things that emerge and arise. For example, in the world of matter, you'll have air, wind, water, minerals. That for me is like the worlds of movements and emotions. But once you start honing in on these driver reactions, you'll see that there's certain processes like RNA production cycles, viruses that have been around way before life came around. Like the fact that we're even discussing whether a virus is living or not is so ironic, because viruses were there doing the living thing way before life ever came around. That's where it all came from in the first place. It's just that cultural living forms formed, and then viruses just maintained being in between. They just never decided to stick around. Some of them do, but the bottom line is that they're not officially part of the living system. Similarly, so from there on, there's a whole bunch of species of animals that start to to emerge specific cultural behaviors, if you will. Like, for example, I've put bees in here. Now, a bee, the bees are born with the ability to perform the wiggle dance. You might have read about this or not, but what's interesting about the wiggle dance is not that they're able to perform the wiggle dance. Now, wiggle dance is the bee moves a bunch of times, and then based on the direction in relationship to the sun, you'll know where the food is, right? Now, it's not only that the bee can do the wiggle dance, the other bees can actually interpret it. And notice that input-output. So the output of one bee is being genetically received by the other bee, and they're able to understand what the bee is saying. Now, that is genetic, but where the food is not. Where the food is just cultural. It's mimetic, if you will. And that's where I'm drawing the attention, is that nest of bees will generate a knowledge of a bunch of honey somewhere that some other nest won't know. Because if they were all born genetically, then everyone would just know where the food is. No, they have to collect information just like us. It's just that their information transmission and collection is just very different from our own. Okay? So these are, and the reason why I put dotted lines here is because this is in between life. This is in between culture. So is it culture, is it not? Well, it's neurons, and they're not, what they learn, like what our cognitive systems learn, is separate from what our genes are telling us to do. Okay? And as a result, I honed in on actual life forms and sociocultural forms. And three species that are confirmed to have cultures are cetaceans, elephants, and humans. Although we can just expand that as much as we want. I'll let science deal with that as much as they want, because research can only show who has culture, who doesn't, and to what degree. Okay? Cetaceans, whales. You can talk to Valeria over there about that. Yeah, yeah. So this is where the concept of memes comes in. But before I get to that, I'm just going to point out one very important term, and that is the term of homeostasis. Like, everyone's heard the word homeostasis. That's when your body is maintaining its temperature, it's maintaining, like my balance right now, maintaining it. They all have, the living system has its own way of maintaining its balance. When it comes to a cultural system, that really is social order. So when you say that a specific community there's order in it, that's literally what it means. There's a homeostasis, a cultural homeostasis happening in it. And if war strikes, that would be like a disease as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Or not necessarily. I mean, like the coronavirus is winning. As far as coronavirus is concerned, they're doing just fine. So it's funny how, like, the judgment of which system is good or bad is really depending. What's the expression? It's the eye of the beholder. It's in the eye of the beholder, right? Okay, so I'm gonna talk about judgment. I actually would like. Is everyone still keeping up? You guys are okay? Okay. Because. All right. So I'm going to read a few passages, because there's probably because I put a lot of thought into some of this, and I mean, I can only say so much, and you see this thing, if you have this book, it's good also as a weapon, you know, you don't need to read it. If someone attacks you, can just hit them across the head. Okay, so, here we go, judgment. The word judge comes from the Latin word jus, which means law, and the word dicere, which means to say. In its essence, it means to speak out the law. Okay? That's very important. Well, I'll keep going. In this context, making a judgment call is acknowledging publicly what a specific rule or law states, and is not a mere opinion, personal or not. From there, to judge someone doesn't merely mean to dislike or even like someone's behavior, but to make a public appeal to start or keep reinforcing a specific social meme about something or someone. This is why a judge judges, but a non-judge can merely play a judge, unless he has established some level of public credibility and acceptance to actively practice making judgments. Of course, many of us have given ourselves allowances to be self-professed judges and take the floor with our friends, family, society, and even with ourselves. Having a judgment, in a sense, is to know how to dominate others socially. You're making basically the call. That's what judgment call is. And it's directly related to the social group. Okay? Memes. What is a meme? As far as I'm concerned, the definition of memes is what one should do. That is, what cultural bid should be performed. Okay, so it means like, so when you, and that's where judgment comes in. Implementation of a meme or an idea is for me to say you have to do this. Okay, memes are knowledges that are protected by society's culture. All other knowledges die with us, and our personal knowledges and opinions. Okay. So it's like if your idea doesn't get into the cultural sphere of your society, it'll just die with you. This is probably one of my favorite parts right now. Okay, so I want to read you this one. So free will is one of those good old topics that you can go online and just hear a whole bunch about, but I've got my own take on it. Here we go. Yeah. Free will versus rules and laws. Okay? Free will is a concept that is culturally defined by humans in human societies. It seems to be relevant explicitly in the context of cultures and how cultures handle the concept of what appears to be a free will act. Humans have the ability to be creative and internally alter their thoughts, making them prone to acting these new ideas out. This exploration and frivolousness can get people into various conflicts if they venture into domains of behavior and thinking that are either considered inappropriate or lawfully forbidden. Note that these don't have to be some hurtful acts or ideas. They merely need to disagree with established societal norms. Many valuable novel scientific ideas were received punitively by many societies throughout the ages. Rules and laws can fight with biology. In a sense, they fight with free will. The problem is not as much whether we humans have free will or not, but whether we have faculties in our brains that give us the ability to be creative, make new choices, and have opinions against the necessity for us to establish and habituate culturally taught norms in our society. Okay? Another one is love is free will and love is commitment. Okay? So now, this is another thing about like thinking about what the word love means. This is a perfect example of where you can have two people talking about the concept of love and completely miss each other, okay? You can love someone by responsibly following a societal commitment, and you can also love someone by following your heart, okay? That is by exercising your free will, really. One of the most common expressions of free will is passed on through stories of young lovers, eloping against their parents' pressures to marry a person of their choosing. On one hand, rules and laws emerge marital contracts that are societally designed to maintain family estates, conditioning individuals to commit and sacrifice. And on the other hand, the frivolousness of the young messes this plan up as their love for each other emerges a rebellion that is directly fueled by their free will. One of the major causes of confusion about the meaning of love is the mixing of these two different and opposing scenarios and assigning the same term to both. I could keep going. Oh, no, yeah, this is good. Hang on. Even human goes through some process of needing to be assigned a role in a society. Okay? Whether it is pressure to pursue a specific career, to marry, to have a house and a dog, or even just to do what one loves. Notice that's also a meme. Each one of these memes will offer an individual specific spot in their society. This is the difference between being in love and to love. Selfishness is loving oneself. Selflessness is loving others. That is one's family, for example. In many worldviews, you're selfish when you attend to your own needs or the needs of your selfishly chosen one. And you're selfless when you attend to the needs of the ones you should take care of, ones you've been assigned to. In this context, love becomes an emergent social rule or law built out of all the needs of individuals that are in charge of maintaining the cohesion of the social groups. I don't know if that came through or not, but that's what I wanted to read about this one, I think. All right, next. Needs emerge morality. This is another term where I created a good distinction for myself, and I found it, somewhat pointed this out, that morality would be in the domain of needs. So whatever you feel is morally right. If you think killing is wrong, personally, that's morality. If you feel that killing should not be done, that would be in the world of ethics, and it's mandated by your society that through its rules and laws saying that murder is wrong. And that comes out of this. Remember how at the very beginning I said that force fields emerge needs and that needs emerge laws? It's the fact that most people don't like the idea of people going around murdering each other, why laws against it exist in the first place. But it's funny that, like, if you have someone who's born who would want to murder, they won't be able to do it because the majority of people don't like the idea of it. And they're actively preventing it from happening through laws and rules. And I love the expression that I like to use, which is genes are selfish, but justice is blind. What I mean by that is that justice in itself doesn't care about how you feel. It's about what has been established to become a societal norm. Okay? How's everyone doing? Yeah, I think this, so I'm at an hour right now. I probably have another about 15 minutes. Do you think you guys have it in you, or should we take a little break? Does anyone need to take a break? What do you guys think? Keep going? Okay, so, okay, here we go. So from here, I'm gonna go to the other side. Oh, so here's the actual front cover. I'm gonna explain what the point of the front cover is. So the reason why I made the jigsaw puzzle in here is because this is a very large picture, and I tried to dissect it as much as I can, so I don't know most of the parts of it. But the main idea is, you have the Big Bang, which is probably a whole bunch of universes out there doing their own thing, but one of it that emerged this bunch of elementary particles, those went into composite particles, into elements, those created molecules. Now this is the interesting part. Imagine that this babushka right here actually contains both of these babushkas right here. Okay, that one and that one. Okay, and one splits off into bodies of just non-living molecules. So this is molecules that are non-living, and a whole other section becomes bodies of biomolecules. Okay, because they're involved in living systems, and then they form, whether they're just floating around in a primordial soup or they're getting involved into living cells, whether living cells, then in my definition, because all I'm doing is trying to trace down where cultures are going. And then living cells will go into elemental knowledges or memory regions. Those are gonna create much larger composite knowledges. Another term for this is neural cross bindings. That's the official term for it. And then, but what's interesting is those will now branch off into certain animals that don't have cultures, like for example jellyfish, they don't have brains, so they don't even have the ability to accumulate any kind of information in them in order to create cultural systems. So they'll branch off, and out of that we're going to have cultural systems that come around. And I'm going to quickly just explore this right now, this last stretch of it, okay? Just like there's cell components here, there's going to be specific, there's going to be specific, there's different ways you can call it. Sort of like societal stratifications, or kind of inner communities that are going to be created. Like people who like to go and be explorative will kind of hang out around each other. This is why I think that a lot of like ancient human societies would have had a nucleus of females predominantly, because that's where the child rearing happens and all the breastfeeding happens and the kind of like nurturance happens, and naturally whoever is more masculinely endowed, if you will, who's willing to venture out, will create the outer layer of exploration, taking care, etc., etc. So it's funny how every societal system, every cultural group that gets formed in a societal system will ultimately have some stratification happening within it, okay? And within that, just like living systems have their viruses, there's always going to be some wandering knowledges around, some opinions. That's what I meant by opinions here earlier, because your opinions are just things that you come up with. Now, your opinion is not the standard norm, but it can float around, it can work very well with it, okay? So from there on, we're gonna have, just like cells get formed, there's socio-cultural groups that form, okay? Okay? And again, we have various kinds of social-cultural groups. For example, you'll have anywhere from, just like the bacteria, there's a small bacterium. Similar, you will have just one small, very unified cultural group where everybody knows everyone, and they most of the time function in some form of an egalitarian system. This section of the project was very interesting because I had to learn about what it means to be egalitarian. What does it mean to be hierarchical? And that's where hierarchies start emerging. And the most interesting, and this is some of the hypotheses that I came up with in this process, is how the hierarchical systems, the fact that we can be hierarchical is actually what ultimately emerged larger multi-level societies, where you can have a bunch of smaller groups of societal groups that coexist together around each other, even though they're somewhat independent with themselves, just like we have a lot of cells in our bodies as well. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into detail with all of this, but an example would be, so this would be a bacterium that has, a bunch of molecules floating around, and the DNA is free floating, everything's getting expressed based on what the environment dictates. Similarly, you'll have some kind of an egalitarian autonomous group right here, where, and this is the interesting thing about egalitarian systems, is that everyone sort of like fends for themselves. You have to know yourself, you have to know how to exist with this, and nobody really tells you what to do. Everybody tells everybody. It's an interesting one. We don't function very much, well, we do actually. It's funny because most multi-level systems like the city we live in are very hierarchical. You know your place. However, I think that where egalitarianism or autonomy comes out is that when you cross the red light on your, decide to cross the red light and break the law, a lot of the times it's the police that has to catch you in the act. But if it's egalitarian, you'll have people around you telling, hey, what are you doing? Don't cross the red light. That, I think, is an expression of an egalitarian behavior, which is everyone's watching everyone and making sure that the social order is in place. You're not relying on some hierarchical body or governmental system to regulate that. But anyways, that's a whole field. So some examples that I found out is that this is Archaea colony. And I found some papers where say that supposedly that certain beluga whale groups are actually non-hierarchical. They don't really do, they all function in a way where there's no governing group of whales that exert their ways onto the others. They all exist. I can't go too much into detail about this, but certain beluga whales, I just decided to throw this in because it was a good example. Humans also have their own egalitarian systems. An example of a governed system in the eukaryotic cells, you would have a nucleus. And this is where I found this fascinating, because it's not like I'm trying to invent, I have to invent hierarchical systems in order to, no, they just exist. And this is where I'm like, well, it's funny how as things emerge in our universe, sometimes they're very similar. And in this case, you have a nucleus that is quite literally regulating. Go look up nucleus. What does nucleus do? It regulates and governs the cell functions, quite literally. Like it tells which genes to get expressed, and the rest of the cell has no say on it. It has to go with it. Similarly, in a governing body, there's going to be like, for example, if the owners of this place are, okay, we're done, like we have to call it, or whoever's in charge, you abide by the specific smaller group that's within the body. And this is another thing that's genetic. We're wired to want to take orders and have somebody else who's going to lead us, right? And this is where, as Robert Sapolsky always pointed out, is like this is why humans are so confused, because we can both be very egalitarian and we can be very hierarchical. And when those two start fighting against each other, that's when you have a lot of problems. But that's probably one of our curses as human creatures. Examples, this is like spore-making multicellular part of a body. So like, mycelium and fungi, plants and fungi have this. So this is an example where each one of these cells has its own governing system, but they all work as a big cohesive unit. This would be a multi-level society with elephants where this is a matriarchy. So the females here call the shots, and males don't even necessarily live in it, but they're an essential ingredient in it. So they're always around, they're just on the peripheries of this society, right? Then you have a similar situation with snub-nosed monkeys. This is a fantastic research that I found where they literally describe the entire thing of how you have these different groups of societies. These are all independent. If this one disappears, the entire society continues to function. And then you have the solitary males. And what I love about the solitary male presence in all of these societies, it's almost like their backup. If something happens to the alpha male in one of the groups, there's a lineup of solitary males that are ready to jump in, which creates such a strong stability to this entire social system. So these are some examples of multi-level societies. And then some more. This is a very complex one. So this would be like our blood cells, the membrane between the bloods, and the neurons with their glial cells around. Similarly, you have like a shopping mall. We went shopping one day, and I'm like, oh, interesting. Like, you have your bookstore, and every store has its manager. And then you'll have people. It'll be a traditional family where two parents make sure they have two kids at least. And then you'll have a bunch of kids, friends who come. And notice how I didn't put a governing system in with this bunch of friends, because most of the time when friends go out, unless there's a dominating one and everyone's like, oh, whatever you say, go, most of the time it's very egalitarian, right? That's at least how it functions. So this would be one example. And finally, so this to wrap up the whole thing. Wow, 1 hour and 13. It's not too bad. This would be our classic tree of life, okay? And the tree of life is defined by how the living systems are organized, okay? And the way this was classified, you can classify any tree of life or any living system whichever way you want. But the way it was done was depending on whether they're prokaryotes or eukaryotes, meaning whether they have a nucleus or not. Right? So all the living forms that don't have a nucleus are on one side, all the ones that have are on the other side, and I've noticed that then some of them are still unicellular of the eukaryotes, but most of them are multicellular, and right in there around the bilateral animals is where I noticed that where the emergence of culture begins. Now, we can argue whether fungi have cultures, but I would call that a separate type of a culture if there is any. Okay, and then so based on this model, I just decided to create a tree of culture, and I just threw it in where I said all the bilateral animals separate to autonomous groups and to hierarchical groups, and out of that you have a whole bunch of groups, societal groups, that will form specific entities, whether they're totally egalitarian over here or whether they're hierarchical, and then some of them are going to be multi-level, because not all of them are, and they'll go. And I even went as far as putting fish in there just because they have neurons, even though technically one can contest and say, sorry, but fish don't have culture. But I put it in just because everything that has a neuron and a brain, as far as I'm concerned, has some level of culture in it. And I think that this is pretty much it. This book, by the way, was never written to be sold. So that's why this is not a book release. It's more a book presentation. If you want to have a PDF of this, you can. I made culturarasa.com. You can go there and download it if you want, buy it. If you're interested in a physical copy, just come and talk to me, because I'm not mass producing this. I'll sign it, And then if you want to, what is it? This is important. I printed a couple of copies that they messed up a couple of the prints, so they gave me extra copies. So I have extra copies. If anyone's interested in this and you just want to borrow it for a month, come and talk to me and I'll sign it out. If you just want to know about it, I'm not in it for the money, because if I were, this book would not be in the format that it is, just so that you know. And so to leave you all off before we break, I want to read you a poem, okay? So even though this is not a poetry night, I wanted to put poetry in this thing. In every section, in every book I wanted to put, I have a lot of artists that I really love, and I think one of Leonard Cohen's songs really sums up this entire thing. And I'm going to read it out to you, and I'm going to put it up right, and that hopefully will finalize the evening. This song is called Steer Your Way. And here we go. Steer your way. Steer your way through the ruins of the altar and the mall. Steer your way through the fables of creation and the fall. Steer your way past the palaces that rise above the rot, year by year, month by month, day by day, thought by thought. Steer your heart past the truth. you believed in yesterday, such as fundamental goodness and the wisdom of the way. Steer your heart, precious heart, past the women whom you bought, year by year, month by month, day by day, thought by thought. Steer your path through the pain that is far more real than you, that smashed the cosmic model, that blinded every view. And please don't make me go there, though there be a God or not, year by year, month by month, day by day, thought by thought. Steer your way, O my heart, though I have no right to ask, to the one who is never, never equal to the task, who knows he's been convicted, who knows he will be shot, year by year, month by month, day by day, thought by thought. They whisper still, the ancient stones, the blunted mountains weep. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make things cheap. And say the mea culpa, which you gradually forgot, year by year, month by month, day by day, thought by thought. And that's that. Thank you. Actually, I'll leave that. Thanks for everyone for coming out tonight. Yeah. This is my 5 years of my life wrapped up finally.